It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first Wednesday afternoon lecture of 2011. If you have not seen the lineup that is already in place for the next few months, please have a look on the web, because I think you'll agree we have a remarkable group of speakers coming here to Missouri on Wednesday afternoons, and I hope you will make this a regular part of your week's experience. It is a great pleasure to be able to invite and have accepted such remarkable speakers from all over the country, all over the world, as is the case today, to come and tell us about really exciting science that is going forward. And I certainly encourage people who decide to use these lectures as a means of expanding their own horizons. This is a great way to do so, and you shouldn't limit your decision to attend just because it happens to be in your own field. I certainly find, from my view, this is a really remarkable chance to expand those horizons. And today is no exception. In fact, I think we're in it for a treat, hearing from someone who is a physician, who is involved in global health, who brings a perspective from another country and from an organization, namely Médecins Sans Frontières, which has had a major significant role in terms of promoting both global health and human rights. Jean-Hervé Bradol is a research director at the foundation called the Centre de Réflexion sur l'Action et les Savoirs Humanitaires, which, if you figure out the acronym, is CRASH, which here in the US is crash, and I presume that has some significance of that sort in France as well. Maybe there's a little in-joke of some sort there that we'll hear about. Jean-Hervé has been with this organization for a while, but has been with MSF now since 1989. He is trained in tropical medicine and emergency medicine and in epidemiology, receiving his degrees in Paris, and joined up with MSF in 1989 and has been involved in many missions in various parts of the world, including Uganda, Somalia, Thailand, Tajikistan, Rwanda, Kano, Nigeria. But today he's going to tell us about a story related to malaria, and specifically to the effort to try to do something about resistant malaria in Asia and Africa, although for all I know he may tell us a few other interesting stories about what's happening in global health. So it's a great pleasure to welcome him to this podium. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bradol.
Thanks a lot. Good afternoon, and thank you for attending this presentation. Let's say that I'm a bit impressed because, as I have been introduced, I'm far from being a scientist myself. I'm a practitioner, and it's also a bit the topic of my presentation. It's to try to make you understand how a group of practitioners have been involved more and more in research activities, and I will try through the malaria drugs example to describe the various states of this involvement. The story starts in the early 90s. I was assigned as a field coordinator in refugee programs at the Thai-Burmese border, Tak province, Mesot district into Thailand. And we were in charge of the health activities for 35,000 Burmese refugees living in refugee camps that were more small villages in remote, mountainous jungle areas. And when I arrived, it was during the beginning of the rainy seasons, and malaria was running out of control in our camps. We had outbreaks with many deaths. And my colleagues have already tried, of course, chloroquine, SP, better known as Fansidar, we were using mefloquine, 25 milligrams per kilo. We've tried also alofrantride, just to say that we were trying all the drugs available by this time, and we were still failing by, for example, 1/3 of children under 8 years old were not treated with very high dosage of mefloquine. So the first step of medical innovation in our setting is always to have clinicians stubborn enough to recognize that they are failing. And of course, a failure in itself noticed by physician is not enough. You have to document scientifically, according to standards that you know better than me, and publish the data. We were lucky enough to jointly work with a research team established within the refugee camps by Mahidol University from Bangkok and Oxford University in UK. And that's the second remark. You know, in our work it has been always striking how the contribution to science done by local teams have been underestimated. You know, this research team, the Choklo Malaria Unit, is made of refugees. You know, most of the senior positions are occupied by refugees themselves. You know, and they run the show in terms of malaria research, with, of course, some support from foreign doctors and foreign researchers, but the main structure is composed of refugees. So, due to their activity, we were able to publish the failure that we were facing, and we were also able to study the efficacy of new protocols. And new studies mean new ethical dilemmas. That's also one fundamental aspect of the work in our settings. For instance, in this very case, we were studying drug protocols among a population that was not well positioned to say yes or no to a proposal, because what's the meaning of informed consent when you're a refugee and when you're proposed to enter a protocol by the same consortium of organizations that feed you, that deliver food to you for or your daily medical services? You know, one other ethical obstacle is the fact that when you settle a research team in a very precarious environment, you tempted to overuse them, to reproduce study among the same small group of population. It would be a bit like if the new anti-hypertension drug would be studied in the same village in the US, you know. There were uneasy choices in that sense. But before to study new protocols, alternatives, you have to identify them. And in this very example, it's our patient who did inform us about alternatives. We were, as I said, the most common anti-malaria drug were failing in our case. On one day, we had a patient coming back to us, and it was more a series of patients over several weeks, telling us, okay, you cannot cure us with your drugs, but we are buying a new Chinese drug at a smuggler market alongside the border, and with this drug we are cured. You know, and I asked my patient, okay, but what's the name of the drug? He didn't know. Where I can buy the drug? He told me, you are popular among the guerrilla group that is controlling the camp, so you can go to a gas station at this very junction and buy the drug. You know, that's how I discovered in 1992 artesunate. You know, that was smuggled from China through Burma, on arriving in our refugee camps with the medical authorities in charge not even being aware of it, you know. So we started studying artesunate in combination with mefloquine, and jointly with the research team to publish outcome of studies. And it was a major move because I wouldn't say it has solved most of our problem, but a large part of them. But those drugs, because it's a family of drugs, it's artemisinin derivatives family, artesunate is one of them, had three major handicaps to be more largely used. The first one is the fact that they were Chinese, you know, they were the outcome of a competition in between the Walter Reed Institute, the AFRIM, the American Medical Research Institution, and the Chinese traditional medicine institution. You know, during the Vietnam War, you all know that malaria was a major concern for army leaders, because malaria put out of combat much more of soldiers than the enemy. So for both sides, it was a huge concern. So, of course, the US military asked the Walter Reed and the Institute to come up with a solution. That's when mefloquine and allofantrine were brought to the market. And the Northern Vietnamese, they asked their Chinese friends to find a solution. And in a way, the Chinese won the competition, won the medical competition, you know, because the drugs that we are using today to treat malaria are from this family of artemisinin derivatives. And of course, those drugs were not developed according to international standards. And that was the second obstacle, you know. With the research team, we tried to have the Chinese document about them translated, and to try to better understand how they were developed, but of course they were not developed according to our standards, to international standards. And the third handicap was the fact that they were not really patentable. So for any drug company, it was not a good situation to go for a patent and to have a monopoly in terms of trade for something like 20 years and get profit out of it. So it was difficult to advocate for their use at the early 90s. So this set of, let's say, disabilities at work for this family of work hampered significantly during the 90s their progression in our practice. But the main challenge for nous wasn't Asian type of situation. It was Africa, because as you all know, the vast majority of deaths occur in Africa among toddlers, and specifically malaria killed under 2 years old children in sub-Saharan Africa. And in Africa, it's rare that you can rationally use microscopes to make the diagnosis of malaria, for many reasons. You know, I don't mean that using a microscope to identify the parasite on a thick or thin blood sample is difficult, but running a system and maintaining the quality on a mind-term perspective, and organizing the quality control, having a gold standard to make the quality control, or managing the logistic of picking up sample of slides, giving back the result to your laboratories that are spread over quite large territories, it's rarely feasible in Africa. So we were in need of a rapid test to diagnose malaria with a biological confirmation. And it has been a major switch. We found those rapid tests in India, and the first generation, we barely knew them. So we studied them with a Ugandese university in Mbarara. We settled the research team in Mbarara University, and we are carrying out such a work like the one we did about rapid test for malaria diagnosis. On the confirmation of malaria, well, it's not that useful during epidemics, and that's a picture of an epidemic, but otherwise, when you are not checking over with a lab exam, in our data, you treat more than half of your patients for nothing, at least not for malaria. So the presumptive treatment without lab confirmation was the dominant attitude in Africa. It's still, it's switching slowly, but in our practice, we've decreased by at least twofold the number of treated cases by introducing the lab confirmation. But of course, it has been also a kind of scientific work and kind of studies published in peer-reviewed journals, of course, to better master this new generation of tests in our settings. And meanwhile, at the end of the 90s, the situation was worsening in Africa in terms of malaria. In 98, we had an epidemic in Kenya, in northeastern Kenya. In 99, in West Kenya, in Nyanza province, Kisii district. In 2001, we had a huge epidemic in Burundi. Burundi is a small country. By this time, it was 7 million inhabitants. And as I said, the cases were not confirmed by biological tests, but Burundian authorities estimated that maybe something like 2 million inhabitants were touched by the epidemic, and of course, thousands of deaths. And when we studied the efficacy of drugs, chloroquine and SP during this epidemic, we frequently had, accordingly to different provinces, because you know that malaria is not homogeneous over a large territory. It varies a lot from a spot to another. But we had very frequently 70% of resistances for chloroquine, 50% for SP. So we were overwhelmed by the epidemic and not having the good tool to respond. And those tools were becoming available. I've mentioned the rapid test plus the artemisinin family, and in fact they have already they have already entered the African continent. They were sold in the private sectors at a very high price. In Burundi, they were even reimbursed by the public health insurance for public servants, but not authorized in public health institutions. So they were forbidden in district hospital, in dispensaries. So we first had to make a new set of studies in Africa to confirm that the usual drugs were failing, to advocate for the introduction of the new generation of drugs. And it was amazing for a group of practitioners like us to end up by doing 1/4 of the overall research output in this country during that period. You know, that period being mid-90s and mid-2000s. And the vast majority of this study have been published in peer-reviewed journals. But then another important stage, you have solid scientific data to advocate for your case, but most of the time it's not enough. In our experience, it takes a public polemic, a public dispute, public controversies to have your case progressing. So by this time, we were involved in public communication with a lot of tension in between some governments and NGOs, in between WHO and NGOs. In the Burundi case, when I went there in 2002, I had a big conflict with the Minister of Health, Dr. Camara, and we both ended up in the President's office, Pierre Buyoya, by this time, the President of the Republic of Burundi, and Buyoya acting as a referee in between us on malaria issues. That's a bit anecdotal, of course, but it's to underline that in our field, which is a rather neglected field, things don't progress without public controversies, and they play a major role in getting good tools, good medical tools to patients. That's other picture of the precarious condition we are working in during epidemics. But that's not enough. Even if you have convinced WHO, and it was rather difficult because the handicaps that I've mentioned earlier about this family of drugs were key arguments for WHO leaderships not to move too fastly on this file. But then when you have the ministry argument on WHO Geneva plus WHO Africa agreement and support to do it, you need to identify supply sources. And they need to be sustainable. They need to be sustainable and of good quality, on good prices. So you start recruiting pharmacists specialized in industrial production. You start sending them in factories to check over, and once again for a group of basic medical practitioners for like us, all of this was surprise. But nothing will move if you don't create the economical condition, because any new protocol means new expenses. On early 2000s, we were very lucky that a renewal of the interest on a renewal of activism for the fight against infectious diseases led to the creation of the Global Fund by the UN Assembly in 2001, a global fund to fight malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV. So new sources of funding were available, and this argument was key when we were in Pierre Buyoya, the President of Burundi office, because all those African leaders, they were telling us, okay, we are medically, scientifically convinced, but economically we cannot afford it, and if there is no new option in this field, we won't move. A set of legal questions must be addressed. In malaria, the intellectual property aspect of it was minor, but it's far from being the case for other drugs. In HIV drugs, it was a major obstacle because due to the way intellectual property was used, treatments were sold at very high prices at the end of the 90s. It was something like 10,000 US per patient per year for anti-HIV drugs, and it was unaffordable for our patients and for organizations like us. So we had to, with states like India, Brazil, Kenya, Thailand, challenge intellectual property rules that were on the way of being globalized through the World Trade Organization Doha cycle, in a large alliance of southern states and on NGOs. We've obtained in 2001, in November 2001, at Doha, Qatar, flexibility about intellectual property, and even a statement from WTO Assembly that public health needs would prevail on intellectual property in face of major public health issues. On the flexibility obtained by this time, we are still living on them for our drug procurement. Then you need to obtain administrative authorizations. So you start recruiting an army of administrators and lawyers to send them everywhere in a public institution, to have your drug registered, to have authorization of import, and a lot of work like this. Then you have to write the new protocols and to train staff. So it's quite a long process. And finally, you are not always pleased by the outcome, because if you want a good drug, it has to be developed from the earliest stages with your specification. You know, the type of patient you have, the type of circumstances you are working in. And most of the time, the drug development is not made for the vast majority of patients of the world, the type of patient we are working with. So the difference is it's a difference like this. You know, either you have that's an adult treatment, amodiaquine artesunate. In one hand, you have 2 pills because we've developed this treatment from the earliest stage according to our specification. In another hand, you have 8 pills for an adult per day, and it's not favoring the adherence to the treatment and the positive outcome to the treatment. So finally, we ended up creating a foundation with the Indian Medical Council for research, medical research, Malaysian Ministry of Health, KEMRI with Kenyan Medical Operational Research Institute, with the Pasteur Institute network, with the Brazilian Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, with more or less a kind of public pharmaceutical company for Brazil. And we've started developing drugs by ourselves for very neglected diseases with our specification in Kala-Azar, in sleeping sickness, in malaria, and we ended up having this type of activities through a foundation in Switzerland as a joint venture with the other partners. And that's the type of story that we have studied in my small research center. It's how medical innovation occur in our settings. And we've selected a group of stories. We were rather positive. They are not always positive. We are also participative to stories that finally were major failures or failures. But to try to convince our colleagues that we have to further structure this part of our work, medical research, we've chosen a set of rather positive story. Cholera, it's the cholera treatment center. Treatment of cholera is water plus salt plus sugar, so it's not high science. You don't even really need the antibiotics. So, but the the framework where you deliver the care is essential. Before the 80s, they were only delivered at district hospital level, and of course, patients couldn't reach them, and mortality was very high. And we developed a model of a decentralized cholera camp in the refugee camps in Malawi. Refugees were Mozambican fleeing the civil war in their country. And that's the model used today in Haiti to respond to the epidemic in an open settings. In meningitis, we contributed with the Niger government to set up the standard treatment for outbreaks, the oily chloramphenicol 1 intramuscular shot during outbreaks, which is a very useful treatment when you are overwhelmed by the number of cases. In human sleeping sickness, we have developed an alternative for the stage 2, the neurological stage, an alternative to arsenical derivatives. The main treatment was a poison, in fact, killing in between 2 and 10% of the patient treated. So we were desperately in need of an alternative, and nobody was interested, of course, because there is no market, no profitable market in this kind of story. So we've developed an alternative, a combination of eflornithine and nifurtimox that was accepted as a referral treatment by WHO a year ago. So on HIV, we contributed, and we were among the first ones to prescribe HIV drugs in remote rural settings in Africa, and to develop protocols to do that without the same means than the means used in developed countries, because lab exams were not accessible. So we had to simplify and frame the treatment in different manner. That's what we have studied. Why we were committed to that? It's because first, when I started my career in this field, it was a totally deserted landscape. I would have never imagined to be involved in medical research. My professor, when I told them at the end of university that I was most probably will be working for a humanitarian organization, were, let's say, pissed off, because you spend years training your students, and then he abandons any ambition in terms of scientific activities. But it hasn't been the case. It was a deserted landscape. Very few number of drugs were developed during 30 years for tropical diseases. And research pipes were close to empty. And today there is a renewal. And we have much better options to treat our patient, and a kind of future that is more bright than previously. And this work is done, that's what I want to underline as conclusion. This work is mostly carried out by charitable institutions. You know, you have a list of them. There are product development partnerships. They are non-for-profit, of course. They are a mix of big pharma representative, states representative, NGOs representative, association of research representatives. And they cover today, the TB Alliance is one of them, major publicity issues. And in my opinion, they need to be a bit more scrutinized for their outcome, because good intention, don't automatically make good outcome. And it's also a bit frightening to see that key public health issues, global health issues, like tuberculosis, for instance, is in the hand of a private, charitable institution. So we wanted to contribute to the review of this research effort by publishing our own records concerning our participation to that research work. That's why we wrote that book. Thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to answer your question.
Well, we have time for questions, and there are microphones in the aisles for those who would like to address some of the issues that were put forward by Dr. Bradol. Certainly the experience from Médecins Sans Frontières across many areas is something we can all learn from. Let me just ask you, in terms of the malarial experience, having seen the emergence of drug resistance in this refugee camp, of course, the fears of new resistance are now growing, I suppose, in that artemisinin doesn't seem to always be effective, particularly, I guess, in some reports from Cambodia. And there are concerns about whether use of monotherapy may be encouraging that to emerge at an even greater level. So from the lessons that you've already traveled through here in terms of how difficult it was to manage the resistance at that point, now with some respite, but maybe with looming danger signals in the future, are we doing everything that we should to try to prepare for this undoubted next battle in terms of the parasite versus the drugs that we have available, or are we not really in a good way ready for the next one?
There is two aspects in it. The first one is the medical activities in itself, you know, setting up resistance studies, for instance, and documenting it, exploring it, scientifically speaking, but you also have a share of the responsibility for governmental institution, because in Cambodia, the example that you have mentioned, well, maybe 80% of the malaria drug on the market are very low quality. For instance, we dedicate a lot of attention, scientists dedicate a lot of attention to study drug clearance and slow drug clearance as a factor for resistances. But meanwhile, you have on the market compounds with a very low quantity of drug that will help the parasite to develop resistances. So that also, there is a part of the work which is out of reach of doctors or scientist activities.
You work with a lot of difficult situations, but perhaps some of the development work that you've been doing could be applied to more developed nations for rare and neglected diseases. Have you thought of those possible applications or worked with any people, organizations on those areas?
Thank you. I think it's also one very interesting aspect. I didn't dare mention it too much, but I think this will lead to south to north transfer of know-how products. I give you one example. When we wanted to start with anti-HIV drugs, of course, I said it, our conditions at work were very precarious. So we wanted to simplify everything, you know, almost no lab, to make it as simple as possible. So with an Indian generic company, Cipla, we managed to produce all the three antiretroviral drugs in one tab. So imagine in 2000, we started prescribing it in 2001, so our patients were receiving the treatment one tab by morning, one tab by evening. So they had a more comfortable situation than the patient in US or in Western Europe, and you all know that the number of pills to be taken per day per treatment, it's far from being in a detail in terms of outcome for a cohort. It's a major factor of success or not. That's an example there, but there are other examples that this work can profit a larger group of patients than the one located in the south.
I'm Joel Bremen from the Fogarty Center, and you'll be happy to hear that a month ago, NIAID and the Fogarty Center convened a conference on artemisinin resistance and actions to take, and WHO and a lot of groups were involved there. This is a remarkable presentation. You've shown that just getting evidence, important as that is, does not result in action unless you really confront the decision makers and get them involved in what's going on. So Médecins Sans Frontières has been marvelous in doing that and in changing the first-line treatment to ACT from the others. My question relates to the patients who don't have a positive malaria smear. Certainly the rapid test is great, but what is being done to diagnose the other common diseases at the front lines? You mentioned a little bit about getting some modern, innovative lab tests out there for invasive bacteremia, HIV, meningitis, kidney infections. Some groups are involved in that. Is Médecins Sans Frontières developing some of those technologies?
But I give you an example. We're working with a Cambridge, UK immunology lab led by Ellen Lee to develop a point-of-care viral load test. You know, maybe point-of-care, it's a bit an exaggeration, but a viral load test, semi-quantitative, that you could perform in a remote African dispensary, you know, for HIV, for viral load. So to have an indication about the viral load, it is, for instance, above or under 1,000 copy per millimeters. But our role in that, we are not scientists, and the people who are doing that have competencies that we don't master at all. But we are involved at the early stages to define the specification. You know, what is going to be the threshold that we need? What is going to be the energy power for the small machine? What is going to be the qualification of the staff who will handle the device? We set the specification in partnership with the researcher. And then at the end of the research process, we participate to the first field test of the new lab test, point-of-care lab test. So yeah, we have an involvement, but let's say it's still we don't pretend being a hard research institution, but as a group of practitioners, we try to participate to research in those ways. And it's also, just I want to add, so a good example of a feedback that could be positive for patients living in developed countries. You know, unless there is a major breakthrough in terms of HIV treatment or HIV vaccine, we all know that if you are under treatment, you will have to cope with the treatment for decades, you know, now. On going to hospital, you know, those point-of-care tests to check over your treatment is well controlling your viral load. I think it's also a hope for patients in developed countries to gain a kind of autonomy to check by themselves with rapid tests. For instance, I think about diabetes patients, the way the therapeutic responsibility has been shared in between health professionals and patient. And for long-lasting treatment, it's essential that the patient feels in charge. On this kind of tools, the point-of-care test for HIV viral load could be like the pregnancy test that you can find in any drugstore, and also an interesting tool for northern countries.
Many of us here use microscopy in all aspects of biological research, so it's a kind of a challenge when we read or hear that microscopy cannot be used in the field. So I would like to know, is it because of the power lack or lack of uniform power? Is it because the instruments are too complicated? Or is it the necessity to maintain the samples in good condition? And what can be done to improve that, since microscopy is a very important tool, I imagine, for not only malaria but probably other diseases?
Well, the reasons are many. The first one is not the equipment. The first one is the managing the staff. If you have a network of microscope in a rural area, you first have to train your staff. But the most difficult part is the supervision, because if you're not organizing quality controls, you perfectly know that the quality, the predictive values of your tests will decrease. The clinician will notice it and not take into consideration the outcome of a laboratory test anymore. So you have to pick up a sample of the slides regularly, to find a gold standards. And finding a gold standards, it's not that easy. It's usually a very senior microscopist specialized in malaria. And you have to organize the logistics, so the car trips to pick up your samples, to give a feedback. The society where you are working has to be already well structured to make this feasible. It starts with the condition of roads, with the availability of fuel. The energy for the microscope itself is not the major issue, because you can still use the sun as a source of energy for malaria diagnosis. But the maintenance of the microscope in itself, how you care for a microscope, it's like a gem, a microscope. You have to, when it's very humid in tropical areas where you have very hard rainy seasons and more than 100% humidity in the air, etc. If your staff is not well taking care of your microscope, they're not going to last very long. So a set of parameters like this make the micro. And never forget that those people are poorly paid. So poorly paid, poorly motivated. So you have to use the most simple way of handling your work. Otherwise, the reasons for failing are too many.
Just quickly, we previously had heard about possible improvements in that area where cell phones might eventually be useful as microscopes or telemedicine sources. Any news on that frontier yet?
Well, today when we are talking about a public health program, the magic stick mentioned by everybody is cell phones. It's true that it has changed the relationship with patient, because if your patient is not attending the consultation, you can now phone your patient. In our settings, it's a kind of revolution. But what is the worst handicap in our work is the fact that those health systems are not patient-friendly at all. You cannot imagine how rude it is for a patient in a consultation room or in a ward. when you treat an acute disease, it's already a handicap. If you're making a delivery or whatever. But when you treat a chronic cases, not being patient-friendly, it's not going to work at all. So, of course, technological tools like cell phone will be something interesting, but it's what we need in the country where we're working in. It's more a cultural revolution among the health staff to learn how to be patient-friendly. Because the quality on what we call the observance of treatment, the quality of relation in between a patient and doctors, it will be based on the doctor attitude more than on
There is another question. Yes, please.
Sorry, everybody. I just have a more naive question. So, when you're developing drugs for developing countries, how are you going to balance the quality of the drug and the quantity that you're going to make? For example, if you are making one grade A drug, you can save one person. Versus if you make like the cost of one grade A drug, you can make 10 grade B drug, who can save like 10 people. But it may take a longer time for those people to recover. So in terms of making this development, how are you balancing between the time and the cost effectiveness and you see what I mean?
It's not a totally rational plan activities. It works by opportunities. Then about the quality of drug, of course. We are working with drug companies to develop drugs accordingly to standards. The best way for us, if we want to be authorized to import those drugs in the countries we are working in, we need them to be registered in the European Union or with the FDA here in the US. It's the best argument towards local national authorities to have authorization of import. We've mainly focused, and the name of the institution is Drug for Neglected Diseases. We've mainly focused on what we've estimated being the most neglected. Diseases like leishmaniasis, human African trypanosomiasis. We also explore the possibility for Buruli ulcer. So that's we found the most neglected as a priority because other topics are more covered by other institutions.
I think there's one more question I had ignored, and then we'll break for the reception. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My question, actually two questions kind of interrelated, but we'll see what we can do. Concern Haiti and the post-earthquake relief. The president of Haiti has strongly criticized the NGOs there, I guess, for being wasteful or for not coordinating their efforts. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we also have this rather nasty cholera epidemic going on. And do you have any comment about what the president of Haiti has said? And also, could more have been done to prevent it or control the cholera epidemic in a better way?
Well, what the international relief system can do, I think I know it. Emergency relief operation, feeding a large group of people, giving them plastic sheetings on tents as a shelter, basic food, basic health services, etc. That's for sure the international relief system can do that. But when the international relief system, as it was the case after the earthquake in Haiti, or as it was the case after the tsunami, pretend that they will rebuild the society and the country, that's pure fantasy. a lot of fundraising activities of NGOs or more globally relief agencies. They are not all NGOs, but some are also governmental too, are pretending to achieve things that cannot be achieved by such an institution. And you can bring some help from outside, but it will ever be minor compared to what the local people do, you know. When, for instance, I give you an example in Haiti, treating the wounded, local doctors and local institutions were overwhelmed. So foreign support was appropriated, was adapted to the situation. But for instance, searching for people within the rebels, you know, at the beginning, you know, maybe 150 foreign teams came for that, and they helped for maybe several hundreds of people. That's it. Most of the people were transported to hospital, pulled out of the rebels by local institutions, by the local Red Cross volunteers, by their neighbors, by their families. And when you witness huge advertising on TV, because it's mainly on TV, pretending that foreign organizations play a major role in such an activity, it's always inaccurate. The cholera outbreak is another story. The cholera outbreak, in my opinion, it most probably have been brought in the country by UN soldiers. You know, Nepalese. Of course, it's always difficult to be sure at 100%, but all the data that are on the table today show that it's most probably imported by the relief system in a way. The Nepalese troops are part of the international relief system. So it's a good example where relief can harm. It's not always at the benefit of a population. To control the cholera outbreak, controlling cholera in an open situation, I mean, besides the jail or refugee camp or an hospital, it's very difficult. Nobody can predict how long the cholera will last in Haiti. Nobody can predict it.
Well, I want to thank our speaker for a very thought-provoking presentation and a wonderful discussion with great questions from all of you. So please let's thank Professor Bradol again.